Hey y'all, welcome back to DEI in 5. I'm Adrielle. Today's episode is going to be a little bit different. I want to leverage my platform. I want to leverage my platform today on this final day of Mental Health Awareness Month of 2023 to talk about Black mental health. More specifically, I want to provide a 3-step guide for Black folks that are looking for a therapist. This is a process that I've used myself over many years. Before therapy was even a thing that was talked about on social media, I was in therapy. And it's a process that I'm using currently to find a new therapist. I have been pretty open about my mental health journey and, my experiences with depression, anxiety, ADHD, amongst other things. And so one thing I've noticed over the years throughout my journey with mental health is that it's just never easy to find a therapist. And I was recently talking to a friend who is considering therapy for the first time, and they were like, I don't even know where to start. And it made me realize how many resources there are out there, but it's almost overwhelming to the point where you just kind of get paralyzed and you don't even know where to start. So I figured I would share this 3-step guide. I will preface this by saying I'm not a mental health expert or medical professional by any means. I have, however, like I said, been in therapy for many years, for I want to say over 10 years off and on. My grad thesis was also on Black mental health specifically. So I spent a lot of time and have continued to spend a lot of time exploring this area and this topic. So with that, and also we're going to be talking about mental health. I'll be talking about mental health conditions and perhaps also touching on self-elimination. So trigger warning, just want you to be aware of that. So with that, let's get into it. So before I get into this 3-step process that I like to leverage to find a therapist, I just want to share a few stats because I love data, I love research, and I think it kind of drives a lot of this home for us. According to the Health and Human Services Office of Minority Health, Black adults in the U.S. are more likely than white adults to report persistent symptoms of emotional distress, like sadness, feelings of helplessness, feeling like everything is an effort. Black adults that are living below the poverty level are more than twice as likely to report a serious psychological distress than those with more financial security. But despite those needs, only 1 in 3 Black adults with mental illness actually receive treatment. So there are a number of barriers that are tied to, people seeking mental health care and support. First, I'll call out, socioeconomic disparities. So often, people don't have health insurance. They don't have the resources that are necessary, or they're unclear of how to navigate the resources that are available. There's also an issue with provider bias and misdiagnosis, which I'll touch on a little bit more today. But a lot of individual providers, not just mental health providers, but medical professionals, often have biases that they have not checked. They allow this prejudice and this discrimination to perpetuate, which within the health system creates issues and it just continues to fester. And there's also a lot of research around how there's often a lack of cultural competency, especially as it relates to mental health care, that can lead to misdiagnosis or inadequate treatment. For example, Black folks are actually more likely to receive a misdiagnosis of schizophrenia when they're actually displaying signs of mood disorders. Again, I'm going to link a lot of information and resources below that covers all of these studies and links to articles and things like that about it. And then the third thing that often results in Black people not seeking mental health care is stigma. That's probably the most prevalent that we talk about amongst our community or within our community. Often there's shame around having a mental illness or naming it a mental illness. People fear that they'll be discriminated against due to a condition. And that's a sentiment that is really prevalent, especially amongst older Black adults. They see mental health conditions as a weakness or a consequence of personal weakness, which that's not the case at all. And historically, there's also been a heavy tendency for Black folks to rely on their faith and religion over seeking medical diagnoses. So just a few things to highlight. The last thing I'll say before I get into this, there was an article that a friend of mine shared with me yesterday or last night. Maybe it was this morning. I can't keep track. The days are blurring together, but I can't stop thinking about this stat, and I think it's part of why I chose to record this video today. Black youth have seen the fastest rising suicide rates amongst any other ethnic group over the last 20 years. And more specifically, we've seen it amongst young black men, where it's risen 60% in that same time frame. So it's a stark number, and it's really unfortunate, and it just means that we have to keep having these conversations, and we have to keep helping each other get the help and the support that we need. Suicide rates amongst Black Americans of all ages are also extremely undercounted, and most of those reasons, unfortunately, are connected to racism, systemic racism. And so I, again, just wanted to share some stats. I'm going to drop all the links below because y'all know I don't just drop facts without linking things. So I will provide links below. But with that, let's get into this 3-step guide. So this guide, and I guess I can call it a guide, that feels weird, but it's just a process. This is how I think about finding a therapist. That's all it is, right? And I'm making this for Black people that are perhaps like considering therapy and you've never gone, but you're like, this therapy thing, it might not be so bad. Or you might be on the other end of the spectrum where you've had therapy or you've gone to therapy and it didn't work, or you're looking at it with skepticism. I want you to know that just if you've been to therapy before and it didn't work, or you didn't feel like it helped you, it doesn't mean that therapy as a whole is ineffective. And I thought that for a long time. My very first therapist that I went to was this older Black woman, and I saw her for a handful of sessions. And every time I went to her, I felt like she was judging me, criticizing me, critiquing me, and it made me shut down. I was like, I'm not going back. But along the way, I encountered other mental health professionals who I just kind of I was following them in passing, and I started to see their approach and hear them talk about therapy in a different way that I hadn't thought about. And then they opened my eyes to the fact that there are different types of therapy as well. So it's really about finding the right fit. And so the first part of this process that I'm going to talk to you about is thinking about the type of therapist that you want or that you perhaps need, right? So there are really 3 categories that I'm aware of. Again, I'm not a mental health professional, but I've, again, been at this for a while, in and out of therapy, researching all that stuff. But there are roughly 3 buckets or categories of types of therapists, right? The first bucket are your licensed clinical social workers or licensed social workers, LCSW, LSW. Sometimes there's also ACSW, which is the Academy of Certified Social Workers. They're also DCSW, Diplomat in clinical social work. So alphabet soup, if you will. But typically social workers are focusing on social work, right? And they can provide therapy typically with a focus on social and community-based issues. So this could help you sort of navigate a lot of the societal pressures that we face as Black people. It can help you navigate family dynamics or community issues that are impacting your mental health. For example, if you are, let's say, struggling with stress-related workplace discrimination, or you're being marginalized in some way, a licensed clinical social worker can provide you with a therapeutic space to kind of process those experiences and to develop some coping strategies for that. They might also help you navigate other resources that are available within your community, especially if you are being impacted by socioeconomic factors that are directly tied to your mental health issues. So that's our first bucket. The second bucket are clinical psychologists. So clinical psychologists typically hold some sort of doctorate of philosophy, a PhD, or a doctor of psychology, PsyD, so PSYD. And they typically specialize in diagnosing and treating specific mental, emotional, and behavioral disorders, right? So they are usually trained in a variety of different approaches, therapeutic approaches that can include talk therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, which we'll talk about, which is probably the most popular that we see online these days. There's also something called psychodynamic therapy, narrative therapy, and there are a number of other things. But a good example of working with a clinical psychologist is like if you're struggling with a specific mental health disorder, such as depression or anxiety, they can help you not only diagnose it appropriately, but also develop a treatment plan that is going to be tailored to your needs. If you are dealing with negative thinking patterns, for example, they can employ different types of therapy to help you sort of recognize and start to change those behaviors. If you are dealing with, trauma from your childhood, right, and you have a lot of unresolved issues there, they may use, again, what's called psychodynamic therapy to sort of bring these deeply buried issues to light, right? And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about the specific types of therapy, but again, that's our second bucket of therapists, right? Clinical psychologists. And then our third bucket are our psychiatrists. And our psychiatrists typically have a medical degree. So usually they are signaled by medical doctor, MD, or doctor of osteopathic medicine, DO. But again, they are medical doctors. They've gone through medical training. And what makes them unique is that they often, not only are they providing therapy, although some don't, some just strictly prescribe medication. So typically they are able to prescribe a medication for you. And so I've found, from what I've seen, again, just speaking from experience, that a lot of psychiatrists tend to deal with like more serious mental illnesses like bipolar disorders, schizophrenia, things like that. But I've also seen them, and I've experienced this, where they've helped with anxiety, depression. I've had help from a psychiatrist with my ADHD as well. And so they can help with a wide variety of mental health conditions, but given their medical training, they can provide you with a really comprehensive plan that not only has therapy like psychotherapy and talk therapy, but can also include medication as well. So those are your three areas or three buckets of therapists. Again, not all therapists are created equal, and it's helpful to just kind of be aware of who's who and who does what. This is not a super straightforward guide. There are some worlds in which, certain providers specialize in different areas or different disorders. And so it's just helpful to be aware of the types of therapists that exist and what they do. So step two is really starting to identify your unique needs and understanding the different types of approaches to therapy. So it's helpful to kind of have a sense of what you're going to therapy for, but you may not know, right? But if you've been feeling anxious, for example, or if you've been having trouble focusing and you're like, I wonder if I have ADHD, right? Or if you've been feeling down and you're wondering if you have some form of depression or a mood disorder, that can help you kind of figure out which direction to go in. But again, if you don't know, that's okay. Ideally, you then want to find a professional who can actually help you get a diagnosis. And then you have to think about the type of therapy and the approach. And so you've probably heard of terms like I mentioned earlier, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, narrative therapy. And so I'll just briefly touch on what some of these are. Again, this is not meant to be comprehensive, but to give you a sense of the fact that not all therapy is created the same. So cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, is, again, probably one of the most common types of therapy that we hear talked about. I see it all the time on TikTok, on Instagram. But basically, CBT is when you have a therapist that you're working with, usually over a structured number of sessions. And it might be as few as like 3 to 5 sessions, or it might be as many as 20, 25 or more sessions. It really depends on your unique needs. But the goal is to help you start to become aware of and identify your negative or inaccurate thinking patterns, so that you can start to view things differently and perhaps take on a different approach. So let's say, for example, that you struggle with social anxiety, and as soon as you're like thinking about going out or going to an event where there are going to be a lot of people, your immediate kind of thought pattern is like, oh my God, what if I say the wrong thing? Or if I make a mistake, everyone's going to laugh at me. They're going to make fun of me, right? CBT can help you start to recognize that you're having that thought, and then start to identify different approaches. Like, how can I replace this, right? So instead of, oh my God, I'm going to make a mistake, everyone's going to laugh at me, make fun of me, you might start to say, everybody makes mistakes. We're human, and most people are going to understand that, right? So it's just a way of shifting your thinking. And I've had CBT therapy before, and I've enjoyed it, especially the parts in between the sessions. So a lot of times therapists will give you homework where they'll ask you to journal or just keep track of your feelings, your emotions, your thoughts, so that you can start to better identify those patterns and actually have it written down. So super helpful in a lot of ways. It can be a really effective tool for dealing with a lot of different issues, from depression, anxiety to PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. I've heard people using it for OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, eating disorders, and other things. The second type of therapy that I'm well aware of that I recently was exploring is called narrative therapy. And narrative therapy is really interesting because it basically challenges you to separate you as a person from the situation and the story that exists, right? So it's all about you sort of being like an expert of your own life and viewing your problems as separate from who you are. So instead of being like, I'm a failure, narrative therapy is going to encourage you to look at the situation and being like, I'm just battling this feeling of failure, and this situation I'm in is really tough, and I'm doing all that I can to work through it, right? And so narrative therapy can be really helpful when you are stuck on a specific issue or problem. And then the third bucket that I'll touch on here is what's called psychodynamic therapy. And it's a type of therapy that is based on the idea that your present day problems are unconsciously linked to things from your past, particularly things from your early childhood or your formative years. And so it can involve exploring some of those emotions, some of those thoughts, some of those beliefs that you learned at an early age, and starting to understand how the beliefs that you formed, experiences, etc., are influencing your present day. So I just gave you an earful, mouthful, eyeful if you're reading the captions. There are a lot of different types of therapy. I just touched on just 3 of them, but those are 3 that I've seen a lot of information about and a lot of people talking about online. Keep in mind, there's no one size fits all approach or situation. Again, I've been in therapy for 10 plus years, and I've used different types depending on what I'm going through in my life and what I need. So it may ebb and flow. You may need one thing right now, you may need something different later. It's all about finding the right fit for you right now in the moment and taking it from there. This is a journey, and so you have to be patient with yourself. You also have to be a little patient with the process and the systems, because quite frankly, the systems are like, they are jacked up and they are not designed for Black folks. So it's tough. It's not easy to navigate. I've been looking for 2.5 months now for a new therapist, and I get so discouraged at times, but I know that I'm closer to finding the right fit. And so I'm going to keep doing it. The third thing and final thing that I'm going to touch on today is really kind of zooming into finding the right therapist, right? So now we know the types of therapists that exist. We know some of the types of therapy and how they could perhaps help us. So you could hopefully start to, as you're going through and looking at different people, you can start to be like, oh, okay, I recognize that. This might be what I need. This isn't what I need, right? But how do you actually navigate that process? First and foremost, if you have insurance, it can be useful to start by checking your coverage. A lot of insurance providers have directories to show you who's in network, and that can be a really good starting point. If you're overwhelmed, don't be afraid to pick up the phone, or I know some of them have like the online chat feature. Ask them to help you find a therapist. Tell them what you need and let them do some of that work. That's what they're getting paid for. On the other hand, if you don't have insurance or if you are low on funds, don't panic. There are a lot of therapists out there who offer sliding scale fees based on your income. There are also a lot of community resources out there, mental health centers, nonprofit organizations that are offering low and no cost therapy. I'm going to link again some of those resources below. There are also, and this is one that I learned about recently that I never even thought about, but there are universities and colleges out there, within their psychology programs that are offering low cost therapy with supervised students. So another option to consider. And so just be aware that yes, there are limitations, but there are a lot of resources. There are resources out there. There are people to help you. So don't be afraid to seek help. Don't be afraid to ask other people. And then once you start to identify some of those people, potential therapists that you'd like to work with, reach out to them, right? Ask if they're accepting new patients or new clients, which is tough because there's such a demand right now. They may or may not be, but it doesn't hurt to ask. And then don't be afraid to ask about their approach, right? You are interviewing them. You're interviewing them to do a job to help you. So don't be afraid to ask them questions, right? Understand what they specialize in, understand their experience to ensure that it is aligned to your needs and what the goals you're trying to achieve. Don't be afraid to schedule an introductory call and ask them these questions and to just see if the energy and the vibes are right? Sometimes it's just a matter of, am I talking to the right person? And are you giving me the dynamic that I need in this situation? For me, I've found that I've enjoyed working with Black therapists in particular. However, as I've started to discover over the past 2.5 months of trying to find a new therapist, the reality is that there just aren't enough Black therapists out there to meet the demands that we have right now. So taking this a step further, if you are considering working with a non-Black therapist, ask even more questions. Ask about their cultural competency. Do they have experience working with Black individuals? Have they gone through any sort of anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion education, training, workshops, conversations? Have they committed to understanding and checking their own biases? Are they aware of common biases that exist within psychology and mental health and healthcare? I was reading something earlier today about CBT, and I'll grab the article as always and link it below. But cognitive behavioral therapy, the type of therapy that I said is one of, if not the most common that we hear about. But the article was talking about how CBT doesn't always work well for Black people. Especially if the therapist isn't culturally competent and aware of some of the limitations of CBT, and also if the therapist isn't using validation techniques. Again, I'll link the article below, but these are things to be aware of because it's so easy to encounter the wrong therapist or have the wrong be using the wrong type of therapy or approach and feel like, oh, this isn't working for me, or this isn't right, or therapy doesn't work. But again, it's not therapy as a whole. There are so many different approaches and types out there. But again, make sure that you are asking those questions to make sure that you are working with someone who is experienced, or at the very least, because again, let's say you go to a university or college with students, at the very least, they should be demonstrating that they have a willingness to learn about the specific experiences and needs of Black people, and not making assumptions, not basing their approach to therapy off of stereotypes or microaggressions or whatever else. So just be aware of that. I just talked a ton. I really hope this was helpful for people. I know, again, how overwhelming it can be, especially when you're not in the right headspace to be looking for a therapist. It can feel so daunting. So I wanted to create this video as a resource for Black people, Again, I'm not an expert. I'm not a mental health professional. I'm not a medical professional, but I'm going to be a resource to link y'all and share my experiences and link y'all to all the things that I come across. And yeah, just keep in mind that therapy is a journey. There's no end destination. And, finding a therapist can take some time, and you may, in some instances, as I said early on, find that you outgrow your therapist, or the approach to therapy that you have doesn't work or isn't working for you, or it works for some time and then it stops working. That's okay. That doesn't mean that, again, that you should just throw it all away and not use it. You also may find, a friend of mine told me this, that you in some instances may need different therapists. So you could have like one therapist for this and then another therapist for this. I never even thought about that, but if you have the resources to make that happen, why not, right? But yeah, at the end of the day, it's important to find what works for you. It's an investment in yourself, your health, your well-being. None of this happens without your mind. So, you got to have a sound mind, and all the stuff that's happening in the world, like even more so of a reason to really invest in your mental health. So take your time, do your research, ask questions. Remember, it's okay to change therapists, to fire your therapist if it's not the right fit, to maybe if it's the right fit, even just let them know, like, hey, this approach isn't working. Can we try something else? Like, what other approaches can we try? Don't be afraid. It's your journey. You're in control. So with that, closing out Mental Health Awareness Month for 2023. I hope this helps somebody out there, as always, and I hope to see y'all back here soon. All right, y'all. Bye.